Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to start talking about Chapter 11 in your textbook, and you'll notice that we skipped from Chapter 6 in your book to Chapter 11 because Chapter 11 deals more with setting up your word problems and doing conversions. And so in chapter 11, we start talking about dimensions. And the very first thing I need you to understand is when we are talking about dimensions, we're really looking at the units. So there are several things that you need to be familiar with. Section 11.1 starts by talking about the fundamental quantities. And the physical quantities that we're talking about are like length and mass and those physical things. And how do we measure the qualities about those physical properties? Well, we actually use dimensions or units to help us with that. And so when we have a measurement, please remember that in order for it to be a correct measurement, you have to have a number that has the correct number of significant figures, but you also have to include a unit. And that unit is the dimension that we're looking at. So again, the fundamental quantities in chemistry are your distance, which the unit for that we measure distance in is the meter, mass, which we measure in the gram, time, which we measure in seconds, the number of particles in moles, and then for temperature we use Kelvin, and electric charge we use coulombs. We use temperature a lot. We don't really use electrical charge a lot. That's one you'll encounter in physics when you take that class. Please remember though, you have to specify what the unit is in order to have a correctly written measurement. Then your book goes on into talking about our derived units, and we're talking about units for things like density or volume, where we combine multiple base units to make the unit. So when we're looking at derived units for volume, if you have a rectangular solid, then you know you find the volume by doing the length times the width times the height. And because all of those are distance measurements, you would expect them to be given in some variation of meters. And so we would have a meters unit, or a number with the meters times a number with the meters times a number with the meters. And so we have 3 meters that are being multiplied together, so that unit would be meters cubed. Also, when we're talking about like density, please remember density is a combination of units. So we have to have a mass unit and a volume unit. So your density will be expressed in like grams per milliliter, or grams per liter, or grams per centimeter cubed. And so all of those units are derived units. Your book also talks about some other ones on page 221. It does volume. It also does speed, density, concentration, and molar mass that we'll spend a little more time talking about in the future. Next thing that section 1 talks about is your intensive and extensive properties. When you look at extensive properties, please remember that we're talking about properties that do depend on how much stuff is there. Properties that do depend on how much stuff is there. So examples of extensive properties are your distance, your mass, your area, your time, your volume, your energy. All of those do depend on how much of the material you have present. But when we talk about intensive properties are independent of the amount of stuff that is present. And so we're talking about things like pressure, like density, like molar mass, temperature, and concentration. They do not depend on the amount of stuff that is present there. And so when we move into dimensional analysis, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be using the units to help you set up your conversion problems so that your units cancel out and you end up with the units that the problem asks you to find. And so that dimensional analysis is just a problem solving method that helps us solve problems so that we get to the answers that we actually need. In section 11.2, that's again where we start talking about how to use the units to set up our conversions. And again, you know that when you start a problem, you're always going to start by identifying what do they give you, what do they want you to find. You know you need your conversion factors in order to solve the problem. And so you need to look at what units did they give you to start with, what units did they ask you to find, and then use conversion factors that will go from the unit they gave you to the unit they're asking you to find. And you do have several examples of that on page 225. And then there's some practice problems there to have you practice that some more. In lesson 11.3, that's where we start talking about ratio units versus two related amounts. And again, we're talking about what do you do when what they give you actually is a ratio unit, or how can you tell the difference between a ratio unit and then something you can write as a conversion factor. And so your book goes through explaining how to differentiate that and how to set up your ratios. Please remember, for most ratios, if there is a division bar in between them, you can replace the division bar with an equal sign and use that as a conversion factor. And so, as you're going to see with the problems that you will primarily be dealing with, when they give you numbers in a problem, the number that has the single unit, not the ratio unit, not grams per milliliter, not miles per hour. Most of the time, the number that has only one unit, that's not a derived unit, that's going to be the number that you start with to set up your conversion. And then your ratio unit will help you make the conversion between whatever units they gave you and what they're asking you to find. Then in section 11.4, you start talking about how do you solve problems that have parts, and you go through setting up a multiple step dimensional analysis problem and how you determine your correct number of significant figures. Please remember, when you're considering significant figures, as you're working through a problem that has multiple parts, you have to give one more sig fig on each part than you actually need until you get to the final answer. In the final answer, you give it with the correct number of sig figs, but in the middle, you keep one more sig fig than you actually need. And then on page 233, that's where you find your review quiz. And again, a lot of that is going through your fundamental quantities and what their base units are. So please make sure you remember those. And then you'll be able to find the answers for the review quiz on page 236. Your book shows you very good examples of doing conversions and getting those units to cancel out. Please reach out if you have any questions at all about that. I do look forward to seeing you in your Collaborate this week. And you know your homework on Chapter 11 is going to emphasize all of these things. So please, please, please make sure if you have any questions, you reach out. I hope you all have a good rest of your week, of your day, and I look forward to seeing you again in our next Collaborate meeting.